Go.
Good evening, America. In recent years, Americans have been discussing several topics that might be in need of reform. The cost of criminalizing marijuana is a definite topic of conversation in state legislatures across the country. Marijuana, also known as cannabis, pot, grass, Mary Jane, and dope, has a long history in our country. People who have smoked marijuana make up a larger portion of society than one may think. For many years, it has been against federal laws to possess, use, or sell marijuana. Recently, state laws have come up against the federal laws by allowing it. Thousands of hours have been spent poring over this legal discrepancy. The dichotomy between the desires of the population, the permissiveness of the states, and the laws upheld by the federal government has created quite a large current issue. This issue is not just being discussed in traditionally liberal states like California and Rhode Island. Several years ago, bills to make the possession of marijuana punishable by fine only, as opposed to a jail sentence, were introduced in conservative states like Arizona and Tennessee. There are several reasons that the legalization of marijuana is such a controversial topic. It can cause people to be high, meaning that they have feelings of euphoria and lowered inhibitions. In this respect, it is not much different than alcohol. Another reason for the controversy is that people often view marijuana as a gateway drug. A gateway drug is a drug which is not very taboo and easy to obtain, and so it is considered to be the first drug that a person tries. The theory is that the enjoyment of this first experience with drugs will lead the person to try other, more dangerous drugs. It is worth pointing out that the majority of marijuana users do not go on to try worse drugs. It is also very interesting that the majority of marijuana users did try legal substances first, such as alcohol and tobacco. In this sense, alcohol and tobacco might be considered to be a gateway drug like marijuana is thought to be. However, these two substances are legal to buy and commonly consumed in any quantity, not for medical purposes, but actually for recreational use. Marijuana, it seems, has an interesting effect on the brain. It produces euphoria, but it is not a stimulant. It also relaxes like a barbiturate, and yet it is not a barbiturate. It has analgesic properties, yet these properties do not come about by the same chemical means as opiates nor aspirin. How then does this actually work? The answer lies in the human brain. A human brain relies on neurotransmitters to help pass signals from one neuron to the next. These neurons are emitted from an axon end of a neuron and cross the gap to the dendrites of the next neuron. Of these dendrites are neurotransmitter receptors. As they are stimulated, they cause a new pulse which then travels along the neuron and is then transmitted from the axon to the dendrites of the next neuron, and so on. The secret to the potency of marijuana lies in these receptors. The brain contains its own version of the chemical that makes marijuana work. The chemical in marijuana is called tetrahydrocannabinol. The chemical in the brain, which are similar, are called endocannabinoids. It turns out that they do not act like other neurotransmitters. It seems that they are produced within neurons and flow backwards across the synapse. This gives them a unique function in the brain. Another important detail is that we need the receptors for these endocannabinoids and everywhere in the brain, or everywhere in the brain. Now, when marijuana is considered, it must be understood that the THC in marijuana is very similar to those endocannabinoids. This makes them affect nearly every part of the brain. This is why they affect such different functions as balance, appetite, memory, depression, and pain reception. Regarding the effects on memory, it is also interesting that marijuana can have a negative effect on memory in a young person, but it might have a positive effect on an older person's memory and may indeed be good for their brain. Marijuana slowly became unfavorable in this country. This may be due to its reputation as an intoxicant, as well as the fact that other medicines were being discovered which were more predictable and considered superior. It was only later made illegal. In fact, the criminalization of marijuana followed an earlier, similar legal experiment. This earlier legal event was known as Prohibition. In order to better understand some of the legal and social forces at work in the criminalization and decriminalization of marijuana, we can begin by learning from this other historical experiment. Prohibition, it seems, began in 1920 after a section of the population took a stand against alcohol because it was considered a bad influence and bad for business. But it was soon found that making alcohol illegal was a far from perfect solution. Any policy as broad in its aim as national prohibition is likely to have a wide range of social effects, including unintended ones on crime, respect for the law, the economy, and so on. Since many people refused to give up alcohol, the illegal sale of alcohol became a large, profitable business. Because the customer base was so large, and because those who sold the alcohol gained a sizable profit, they also gained in power. The criminals involved began to organize and eventually created a profitable, yet illegal, underground market. This helped create organized crime, or the mafia, in America. The power of the mafia was unprecedented. One of their main assets was that they could guarantee people's compliance to their wishes because of threats of violence and their control of corrupt police departments, as well as politicians. It was thought that prohibition would help the economy. So the prosperity seen during the mid and late 1920s was thought to indicate that prohibition was successful. But the economist Warburton produced an analysis that showed a different picture. He used a quasi-experimental approach and estimated alcohol consumption using 3 sources of data. He showed that consumption did decline drastically at first, but by the time prohibition was repealed, it went up to between 60 and 70% of what it was before prohibition. Warburton argued that the largest cost to society was the taxes that the government missed out on. The situation with marijuana is similar to the situation that society had with prohibition, as I stated. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which made it illegal to grow marijuana. Since it was illegal, large prices could be charged in the underground market. Those who sold marijuana were, by definition, against the law, and so they often hired bodyguards and enforcers who broke other laws. Those who used marijuana often could not afford to buy it because of its high price. When they did not make enough money from legal employment, many people started selling it so that they could support their habit. Other people resorted to theft or prostitution or some other illegal activity to fund their use of marijuana. Just as with prohibition, the criminalization of marijuana encouraged more people to become criminals. Just as with alcohol, marijuana suddenly became a large cash industry for the mob, or mafia. People who did not typically commit crimes also found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the law because they were marijuana users. Some of them undoubtedly stopped using it, but many others continued to use it. There were 641,642 marijuana-related arrests in 1966 alone. And most of them were not of people of people who sold it, but rather of people who were using it. In 1914, Congress passed the Harrison Act. This was a federal law that taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates. Initially, it appeared that the act would allow the government to market opium and other narcotics while allowing the government to raise revenue and tax the sale of them. The Harrison Act ultimately made non-medical uses of these narcotics illegal. Still, by 1920, there were plenty of economic action occurring in illicit drug sales. In 1922, the Jones-Miller Act was passed, which imposed steep fines and prison sentences for importing narcotics. Also in 1922, the U.S. passed the Narcotics Drug Import and Export Act to further attempt the restriction of narcotics to legitimate use only. What legitimate use means in this context, and whether there is a legitimate use for marijuana, is a complex question. Although recreational marijuana use is illegal by federal law, many medical uses have been studied. It has been studied for its possible utility in treating psychological disorders such as schizophrenia, depression, and sleep disorders. It has also been studied for its use in helping cancer patients in their fight against losing weight, and has proven useful in the reduction of chronic pain. Another important use has been in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. Using marijuana to control pain is probably the benefit that is most talked about. The findings of several studies show that 27% to 30% of HIV patients obtain significant pain relief from smoking marijuana. Yet, the findings of some studies show that marijuana is not more effective than codeine for treating pain. By the claims of this study, we already have an accepted, well-established drug that reduces pain just fine. Investing in time-consuming trials to prove that marijuana can reduce pain would be costly. Does this mean that it should not be considered for such use? Consider that some analgesics work better than others for different people. It is like this kind of discrepancy is not noticed by these statistics. Another thing to consider is whether codeine is really that good for the human body. By using codeine instead of marijuana, a person might potentially suffer worse long-term side effects. These are all elements of this complex social question which should receive attention before a decision is made. When judging the usefulness of marijuana or categorizing marijuana as a legally prescribed drug, one should consider all of the potential benefits. One should also consider the side effects of many drugs which are currently being legally sold to treat various conditions. It may very well be that the side effects and risk of using marijuana outweighs its benefits to a large degree. And it may be that it should not be legalized for medical purposes. However, the one thing that is clear is that our current understanding of the issue has been hindered so much by the federal government that it is hard to determine the answer to that question for certain. Not only did the Marijuana Tax Act prevent physicians from prescribing marijuana, but in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act identified marijuana as a Schedule I drug. Schedule I drugs are considered to be the most dangerous of all the drug schedules, with potentially severe psychological and physical dependence. These drug substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a huge potential for abuse. Examples of Schedule I drugs are lysergic acid, diethylamide, LSD, heroin, and methaqualone. In attempting to weigh the usefulness and safety of marijuana used for medical purposes, it has become apparent that political interventions such as rhetoric and ideology continue to make it difficult to get a clear picture. There are numerous sources claiming that marijuana holds incredible promises for the treatment of various conditions. But there are also numerous sources claiming that marijuana is useless for these conditions, and which imply that it probably does more harm than good. In 1976, one of the major trials that helped make legal marijuana possible was the case of United States versus Randall, in which Randall was put on trial for growing his own marijuana. Employing the common law doctrine of necessity, he successfully defended himself on the grounds that his use of the drug was a medical necessity due to his glaucoma. As a result of his victory, the government was forced to design a method to provide Randall and others with marijuana. This ultimately led to medical marijuana being dispensed by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, beginning in 1974. Since that time, NIDA is the only legal source of the drug in the United States. In 1996, California voters approved a proposition on medical marijuana, Proposition 215. Under this proposition, the state removed criminal penalties for medical marijuana patients, provided that they were prescribed it from a legitimate licensed physician. In effect, the state of California cannot prosecute these individuals for use or possession, and not even for the cultivation of marijuana. A state police officer might watch such a patient smoke it without taking any action, while a federal agent would still have the legal responsibility to arrest that particular person. It should be noted that this law did not initially set any upper limits that such a patient could grow or possess. It also did not state which illnesses a patient could be prescribed marijuana for. Presumably, that was to be left exclusively to the discretion of the physicians. Yet, even though this would seem to be too lax in its permissiveness, it was only 2 years later that the Alaska, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington state followed suit, with voters approving initiatives on the legalization of medical use of marijuana in each of these states. A reasonable estimate of the consumption of marijuana in the United States is around 3,190,000 tons annually. We know that there have been much stability in the reported consumption of marijuana in the years between 2001 and 2008. There are 14 states considering full legalization, and it is on the table in 17 other states. 8 states are thinking about making the punishment for possession by civil fine instead of criminal penalties. The legal marijuana industry is estimated to top $2.34 billion this year. Deputy Attorney General James Cole wrote a memo indicating that the federal government will stand back and let local and state officials control marijuana commerce. The key word here is control, not profit, not prohibit, as long as enough legal structures is in place to effectively control it. The decriminalization of marijuana will have other effects than simply opening a new economy. Many Americans go to jail each year because of marijuana. In 2012, there were 749,825 marijuana arrests. New York and Texas had the most, and 97% of the marijuana arrests in those states were for possession, not for distribution. The social implications go beyond the simple numbers of arrests. According to Ezekiel Edwards, the director of the ACLU Crime Law Reform Project, African Americans were 3.7 times more likely than Caucasians to be arrested for possession, even though their usage rates are practically the same. Racial disparities are found almost everywhere in 49 of the 50 states. One can only guess the far-reaching effects this has upon racial relations. In short, America is scrambling to recover from the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression. Although the legalization of marijuana could definitely generate untold amount of money for this country, is it really the moral way to go? Will this help or harm youth of our society? One thing is for certain, the cost of criminalizing marijuana is one that Americans can no longer afford to pay. I would like to say thank you for your time. and have a good evening.